Hello and welcome. Today I'll be discussing the mechanics of the Notwithstanding clause, why it was created, how it ended up in the Charter of Rights, and how the most recent uses of the Notwithstanding clause have been completely contrary to its original purpose. The Notwithstanding clause, which is found in Section 33 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, allows the federal parliament or provincial legislators to pass legislation that acts notwithstanding to Sections 2, Fundamental Freedoms, and Sections 7 through 15, Equality Rights and Legal Rights. Once the legislation has been passed, the clause removes the ability for the judicial power to deem the legislation of no force or effect for a period of 5 years. At the end of this period, the clause must be reenacted, otherwise the legislation will become open to judicial review. To understand the true significance of Section 33 of the Charter, we must look far beyond simply its mechanics. We must look at its original intention. The original intention of the clause was to provide the provinces with a sense of legislative autonomy in the light of an expanding judicial power. In response to the federal government's push to entrench the Charter of Rights, provincial legislators sought a democratic override that could be reserved for exceptional circumstances where judicial interpretations of rights drew away from broader public opinions. This ensured that the ultimate authority remained within the elected legislators and not the appointed court. The true purpose of Section 33 was never to create a system of legislative supremacy. In fact, it was actually created to address the complete opposite, a system of judicial supremacy. In light of the entrenchment of the Charter, which granted the judicial power extensive power over the province's legislation, provincial legislators sought a democratic override that could be used to prevent a system of judicial supremacy. Now that we know how it works and what it was intended to address, we can now focus on why it was actually included in the Canadian Charter of Rights. Just like any other piece of legislation, the Charter was never guaranteed to pass. In fact, it required the consent of 7 provinces representing 50% of the Canadian population, as opposed to a simple parliamentary majority. One of the main reasons that we have the Charter that we know today that represents such a wide variety of our rights is due to the fact that the federal government compromised and included the Notwithstanding clause. The history behind the clause itself is very complex, as it went through numerous proposals and negotiations during the creation of the 1982 Charter of Rights. Long before negotiations of the 1982 Charter of Rights had ever begun, the original 1960 Bill of Rights, which was introduced under Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, also included a notwithstanding clause, but it was limited in the fact that it only applied to federal legislation. Therefore, the judiciary could not deem any provincial legislation of no force or effect unless it infringed on the matter of the division of powers. The proposed charter was a significant change, as once entrenched would allow the judiciary to challenge any provincial legislation that infringed on the included rights of no force or effect. This was a significant shift in power from the elected legislators to the judiciary, which sparked concerns over the concept of provincial autonomy. Former Prime Minister, and at the time Minister of Justice, Jean Chrétien, said that it was required to ensure that the elected legislator, not the court, had the final say in important matters of public policy. As negotiations of the 1982 Charter intensified, the concept of the Notwithstanding clause was proposed numerous times. First by Saskatchewan in 1980 as a method to preserve provincial autonomy and authority. Shortly after the Saskatchewan proposal, Quebec introduced a proposal for the common stand of the provinces. which was an attempt to gauge a common standpoint for all the provinces on matters such as the entrenchment of democratic and fundamental rights, but leaving legal rights and equality rights subject to a notwithstanding concept. Quebec would eventually step down with this proposal as it did not end up gaining traction. By mid-1981, negotiations had essentially hit a complete stalemate, as the provinces felt that their concerns over an increased judicial authority were not being adequately addressed. In response, Alberta, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan sparked a renewed push for an override mechanism, as they felt an entrenched charter that did not include such a mechanism would leave the judicial authority with such a commanding position over provincial legislation. At this point in the negotiations, it was almost evidently clear that without such a mechanism in the charter itself, it would be nearly impossible for the federal government to reach the quota of the consent of 7 provinces that represented 50% of the Canadian population. These tensions between the provincial and federal governments would continue until what was known as the Kitchen Accord. In 1981, with negotiations remaining deadlocked, then Minister of Justice Jean Chrétien met informally with the Attorney Generals of Ontario and Saskatchewan, Roy Romanov and Roy McCountry, in an attempt to reach a compromise. On the night of November 4th, 1981, the 3 parties managed to reach an agreement without the participation of Quebec. The Quebec delegation had returned to a separate hotel that was located across the Ottawa River in a symbolic gesture in an attempt to represent Quebec's autonomy to the rest of Canada. Although this agreement was critical in breaking the stalemate, it was not the final agreement that was used to form the Charter of Rights. When Section 33 was originally introduced in 1982, the usage of the clause was purely tied to public reassurance, ensuring that the elected legislators, not the appointed courts, would have the final say in exceptional circumstances. Between 1982 and 2018, the clause was invoked very few times, with Quebec invoking it systemically following the introduction of the Charter, and only 3 provinces have invoked it at least once between 1982 and 2018. Since 2018, the pattern has changed dramatically. Between 2018 and 2025, governments have invoked the clause 8 times, with 2 of those instances occurring within the last 2 months, often prematurely and often resulting in significant amounts of public backlash. These most recent instances are signifying a trend towards legislative convenience and almost a system of legislative supremacy, which was the complete opposite of the purpose of the clause, which was to avoid a system of judicial supremacy. In 2018, right in the middle of an ongoing municipal election campaign, the Ontario provincial government, led by Premier Doug Ford, proposed Bill 5, which, among other things, reduced the amount of sitting councillors for the City of Toronto from 47 to 25. This was done after candidates had campaigned, fundraised, and canvassed their election areas. The Superior Court of Ontario found this act infringed on Section 2B rights, specifically freedom of expression for both candidates and voters. Within hours of this ruling, the sitting government announced that they would be introducing a new bill, Bill 31, which invoked Section 33. Upon this announcement, there was significant public backlash, with protests occurring at the footsteps of the Legislative Assembly of Ontario. Additionally, over 400 legal professionals urged the Attorney General to oppose this invocation. Only 9 days later did the Appeals Court of Ontario announce that they would be staying the decision made by the Superior Court of Ontario restoring Bill 5. At this point, the provincial government announced they would be withdrawing Bill 31. This attempted invocation contradicted almost every original intention of the clause. Not only did it not reflect public priorities, but additionally, at the speed at which the government released Bill 31, it simply didn't even allow for a complete judicial process, which was proven after the Appeals Court of Ontario stayed the decision made by the Superior Court, which allowed Bill 5 to come into effect. This is a clear example of the legislative body attempting to consolidate power and essentially overpower the judicial body to get what they want. Within just the last 2 months, the province of Alberta has introduced 2 pieces of legislation that invoke the clause, beginning with Bill 2, the Back to Schools Act, which forced teachers who were at the time on strike back to work, infringing on Section 2 protected rights. This decision was made at the complete opposite view of the public, who was vastly in favor of the teachers' decision to go on strike, as teachers were facing growing classroom sizes as well as low wages. Only 1 month later did the province of Alberta introduce new legislation that again invoked the clause. Bill 9, which proposes amendments to 3 separate laws, including the Health Statutes Act and the Education Act, particularly in regard to the use of pronouns in schools, as well as gender-affirming care. These 2 most recent instances of invocation are particularly most striking. As with Bill 9, as proposed from the province of Alberta, will make amendments to the Health Statutes Act, particularly that of gender-affirming care for youth. If passed, this bill will be a complete stray away from the core regime principles of both liberalism as well as the protection of minorities. This bill will disproportionately affect individuals that require or request this particular procedure, and leave a vast majority of the province's population unaffected. Additionally, under the concept of liberalism, particularly the harm principle, this procedure, or any surrounding them, don't affect any other individual other than the one it is being performed on. These most recent instances of the clause's invocation show a disturbing future of what it may hold. Governments are now utilizing the clause to pass legislation that aligns with their own party's ideologies, not so much the protection of the public's priorities, rather their own governments. Additionally, with the most recent examples, we are witnessing governments utilizing Section 33 to stray away from the core regime principles of protection of minorities, liberalism, and equality. Thank you.